talk is by Rory Greig and Jordi Arranz. Sorry if I mispronounced your names, from Improbable from the UK. And they'll be talking about generating agent-based models from scratch with genetic programming.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Let me see if I can share my screen. Yeah, it looks like I can't share my screen at the moment. Oh, hold on. Maybe
I just stopped the previous share. Okay. Do you want to try now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we can see your
Can everyone see the slides?
Yeah, great.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Rory. I'm also here with my co-author, Jordi. So I'll be giving the presentation, and then Jordi will be available for questions at the end as well. And yeah, we're going to be talking about genetic programming for learning ABM logic from scratch. So this is a kind of research project we've done on using genetic programming to learn the symbolic code for update functions for agent-based models. This is quite a flexible approach, and we've kind of shown that by applying it to models in two different domains, opinion dynamics and flocking. To do this, we built a flexible domain-specific language in the Julia programming language, which just consists of basic mathematical building blocks, so basic mathematical operators. And the output of this is we get symbolic code, which is interpretable for the agent update functions of agent-based models. So why do we think genetic programming is particularly good for ABMs, or why are ABMs a particularly good target for this? I think it really comes down to this idea of emergent complexity, which I'm sure will be familiar to many of you. And this is that simple rules at the agent level can produce complex behavior at the overall level. And I think this is important. I mean, genetic programming is really difficult to scale. It's a very difficult combinatorial search problem. And I think the benefit of using ABMs here is that we can encode, we can learn these relatively few lines of code for the agent update function. And then we can generate complex emergent behaviors at the macro level. So we still get these complex, sophisticated behaviors without having to learn from scratch these correspondingly really long, complex programs. We can't learn all of the code for an agent-based model end to end. We're just learning this code for the agent update function, but that can still produce that complexity that we want. So that's just kind of to frame why we think ABMs are a particularly good target for genetic programming. And we're not the first people to do this. And I think quite a few authors that we've already seen present at this conference, these are two papers that really inspired us, are using genetic programming already. And it's interesting to note, kind of typically these start with an initial kind of tentative model that uses some encoded domain knowledge. So, we start with maybe a model that we want to improve and mutate, or we start with a random model or something like that. And typically what's being recombined in some of this work is primitives that are relevant to the domain in question. And I think I would contrast this with our approach here is more an attempt to learn from scratch. So we're learning the agent update functions, and we're starting from an empty program. We're not starting from a kind of existing coded function that knows something about the domain that we're targeting. And this means it doesn't require a lot of domain knowledge. There's some priors and assumptions, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail. And I think the advantage of this is really trying to avoid as many human preconceptions as possible. In the kind of spirit of IGSS, maybe this will give us some surprising results that we would have been biased against otherwise if we'd started with a kind of hand-coded model. And another thing we're doing here is kind of using quite a large flexible DSL. So I'll show that in a second. So this is a larger search space and arguably, more general. So there's a larger class we could discover here. And the way I like to think about this is a kind of spectrum of learning models, or a spectrum of IGSS. On the right-hand side, you've got kind of manually coded models. So this is kind of basically just traditional agent-based models, agent-based modeling rather. And then on the left-hand side, we're trying to push more in this direction, which is learning from scratch, having less domain knowledge encoded. And this means it's a harder search problem, but there's more flexibility. And so, going to the right on this spectrum, more domain knowledge and priors, and going to the left is kind of less domain knowledge, but kind of larger search space. And really, we're not all the way on the left there, but we want to show that it's possible to go further to the left than some of these other projects. And I think often, all of IGSS and all the kind of productive areas sort of in the middle here, but it's interesting to know how far left we can go. And how kind of little domain knowledge we can put in and still learn an effective model. And so again, according to the theme of the workshop here about what AI can do for ABM, this was very inspired by some work in AI. So this is a project by Google AI called AutoML0, and this was using genetic programming to learn AI algorithms from scratch. So not just train a neural net, but train the actual learning algorithm. So the code for the learning algorithm, which trains that neural net. And this is starting really from scratch. So using only basic mathematical operators that it recombines. And this actually and again, starting from empty programs, they rediscover kind of two-layer neural networks. So this learning process discovers that itself, like with backpropagation and techniques like regularization. And so, when I learned about this was really kind of a great example of applying genetic programming to a very ambitious problem. So I thought, what if we could transfer this to ABMs and kind of also learn ABM logic from scratch? And yeah, like I said, we created a new domain-specific language because obviously we can't just learn in any programming language. Like we can't just take the whole of Python or the whole of Java and try and learn a Java program. We've constrained this a bit. So we have what we call a behavior, which is just a list of instructions. This has a choice of operator, so some sort of like mathematical operator. It has an output memory address that it can write to, and it has one or two input addresses that it can read from that memory. So it has a chunk of kind of memory registers that it can use as working memory for executing this program. There is a set of operators that the DSL consists of. You can only have one memory type at once for a single experiment. So in the flocking experiment, we have 2D vectors, and we've got 23 operators. For the opinion dynamics experiment, we have 13 scalar operators. This DSL has limited control flow. It has some control flow, so you can have if conditions, which do break the program, or branch the program rather, but there aren't loops and there aren't if-else statements. And then, yeah, there's a finite number of memory locations. And this is kind of, these behaviors are interpreted line by line at runtime. They're not kind of compiled. And there's various performance trade-offs in that decision. And just to give you a sense of what the DSL is, so at the top, you can see the vector operators. So these are basically just very basic mathematical things. There's nothing that knows about flocking or opinion dynamics here. It is just kind of elementary maths and some conditional operators. And the scalar set is slightly reduced, but again, still made up of just basic mathematical operators. And the genetic algorithm itself, so this was basically just re-implemented directly from AutoML0. It's called regularized evolution. It's a steady state population, so we're constantly choosing one from the population, mutating it, and adding it back in. This works by tournament selection, so we choose a random subset of the population. We choose the best one with the kind of lowest loss, mutate that one with a probability, and then add that back into the population. And then in order to parallelize and preserve diversity, we also have multiple of these population pools, which are all running the same algorithm. And I guess probably the most interesting point to note here is that we're doing linear genetic programming. So unlike a lot of the other examples we've seen at the workshop, which are treating the program as graphs or trees, this is just treating the program as a linear set of instructions. And this means the mutation rules have to be aware of what they're doing when they're mutating that in a linear way, so that it still turns out to be a valid program, particularly since you can have if conditions that branch a program. And so, yeah, these mutation rules have to be aware of the search space. So there's various rules that we have. So you can either change an input address, you can change an output address, you can change a parameter value. So there's a fixed number of parameters that the learn program has. I think an important thing to note here is that this means we're basically doing parameter optimization or kind of traditional parameter calibration as part of the same process that is doing this more like structural calibration and learning the code. So we're doing these together, and maybe that kind of gives the opportunity to find even better fits. And then you can also add or remove an instruction. This is biased towards removing more than it adds. And this is just because we want to try and keep the program short if we can. So we're not doing multi-objective search, but we do have biases in the mutation rules that try to reduce the length of the program. And you can also just randomize a big chunk of instructions. And then like I said, we're learning this from scratch. So we're starting with 0 instructions, basically an empty program, and the mutation rules then have to start adding instructions. And the loss function we used, so we didn't have data from the specific domains, so we actually hand-coded some kind of reference models, which are for both flocking and opinion dynamics, and we use data taken from those as the target data to see if we can recreate that by learning these update functions. And then the loss function is actually very simple. It's just the mean squared error between the output of the learned model, so the kind of candidate in the genetic algorithm, and then this reference model output. I think a key thing to note is we only used a single trajectory from the reference model for each experiment. So we basically run the reference model, the hand-coded one, once, take that data set, and then use that for all of the training. So in some senses, this is quite data efficient that we've been able to kind of learn these rules. And then we basically just split that up into data pairs for each agent and each time step. So there's basically the before state and the neighboring state of an agent, and then the afterwards, basically the output of the function. And then that's basically just turns it into a supervised learning problem. Fairly straightforward, really. So yeah, just to kind of recap all of this and show it in a diagram, this is a genetic algorithm. We've got a population that we're maintaining here. We select a subset and get the best behavior. We mutate that, which produces a new candidate. We then calculate the loss function. We only need to do this once because it doesn't change after this. And that's using the reference data from the reference model, but that's only run once at the very start. And that data is used for every loss function evaluation. And then we add that new behavior back to the population. And I guess kind of one subtlety here is that we are also using elitism. So we don't make sure not to replace the best candidate, the best current candidate in the population. Okay, so that's the kind of algorithm and how we did it. So I guess the question now is, did this actually work at all? What happened and what did this look like? So first, I'll explain a bit about the opinion dynamics model we used. This is a very simple model, possibly the simplest opinion dynamics model you could have of opinions propagating. So each agent has an opinion, a value of opinion between 0 and 1. This is a simple threshold model. So basically, two agents are uniformly randomly chosen to interact. So it's like complete mixing. If their opinions are below a threshold closeness to each other, then they will bring their opinions even further closer. So this is basically just the idea of homophily. And I guess the interesting thing to note here is we've got the pseudocode. So this is only 4 lines of pseudocode, but when this is encoded in the DSL, this is actually about 11 instructions long, so 11 lines of code. And this is because like one instruction in the DSL can only do one mathematical operation at once. So even one line of this code has like a minus, a multiply, and a plus. So that would be like 3 different operations. It can do one mathematical operator and then write that output to memory. And that's just to say that even though this is only 4 lines, 11 instructions, that's still quite a challenging program synthesis or genetic programming problem because we do have quite a large set of operators to choose from as well. So did this actually work? And yes, we can see the loss decreases quite reliably with some big jumps and ends up with a very low loss, which shows that we've really managed to recreate the target data from this learned program very, very closely. And okay, this is a chart. The loss value maybe is not so meaningful, so it's worth comparing the actual outputs itself. And on this slide, you can see on the left-hand side is the output from the reference behavior. So this is all of the agents, how their opinion changes over time, and you can see they form into 2 clusters. And on the right-hand side, you can see the output from the model run with the learned update function. And you can see, to me, this is almost identical. It's very hard to spot any differences here. So I think we can be quite confident that this has really replicated the original behavior very closely. So this is run with the same initial starting state as well. And I think even without these labels on top, you'd be hard pressed to say which one is generated and which one is the true model. And then for the flocking model, so this is in a different domain. Just to describe the model itself, it's a very simple Boids model. So we've got simple rules for each agent that then produce these more sophisticated flocking patterns at the overall level. And so each rule agent is basically just following one of 3 rules. So alignment, it kind of steers and it matches its heading to neighboring birds. Cohesion, it steers towards the center of a group of birds. And separation, it avoids getting too close to individual neighbors so it doesn't like bump into other birds. And just from those rules at agent level, you can get these flocking patterns, which I'm sure you've possibly seen before. And this is a bit more subtle than the opinion dynamics example. So we have some hand-coded functionality in here. So for example, we have a spatial grid. This is partly just a performance optimization. So we're keeping track of lots of cells and all the birds in the same cell. And then we also have this move function, which is basically simple physics that takes the new velocity and adds it to the current position. So this is kind of a way of saying, we have some domain knowledge about this, that we have the fact that we sort of know that how physics works and the velocity adds to position. So we'll just hand code this. We don't need to relearn that. But all of the stuff about the domain itself, so anything to do with alignment, cohesion, or separation, is in this function called steer behavior. And this is the function that we synthesize from scratch. So we can say that all of the domain logic is kind of being synthesized here. And the steer behavior basically outputs a new velocity. It takes in the center of mass of agents, its neighboring agents in the same spatial grid cells, and the velocity of neighboring, average velocity of neighboring birds, and the agent's own velocity. And from that from those inputs, there is some function that we synthesize, and then we produce the new velocity, which is then added. And again, we can see the loss decreases very nicely with some large jumps, and we end up again with a really low loss, indicating that it has recreated this target data set very accurately. But there's only so much we can tell from just looking at this chart, so it's good to compare the results subjectively, the actual flocking behavior. So in this slide, we can see a sort of visualization I made to kind of show the movement of flocking, but in a static image. So we can see each trail here represents the movement of a single bird over a bit of time. Again, we've got the reference on the left-hand side and the synthesized model on the right. And even though these are not identical, because this is a chaotic system, so even very small differences will add up over time, we can see that subjectively, these seem like they're almost being produced from the same underlying dynamics. We see similar clusters, we see similar kind of rotations and clustering that you would expect in a flocking algorithm. So similar movement patterns in clusters. And perhaps showing this even more clearly, we can see, again, this is a more extended video of both the reference model on the left-hand side and the synthesized on the right. And you can see eventually they do diverge. There are small differences, but these are very, very similar patterns. And I think we can be satisfied that the right-hand side does exhibit all the flocking behaviors that we're looking for and that are observed in the real model. So I think we can be fairly clear that this has replicated the behavior. And again, it's interesting to see kind of, so from that previous slide, it looks great, but maybe it's not clear what this even starts like. So we're starting from basically an empty behavior where the agents just fly off in all directions because they have a sort of random velocity. So you can see this is a visualization I produced, which just shows how this improves over time. So this is taken at snapshots of the evolutionary process. And you can see as time goes on, I mean, there are loads and loads of iterations between each of these steps. You can see it gradually, these are starting to cluster together. It's only really the last few where you can sort of see the proper flocking patterns. And I think, yeah, this is the last one where you can see nice movement. I'll maybe just play that through again so you can kind of see it because it goes quite quickly. And yeah, I guess this is to show it kind of starts with nothing that looks like flocking at all and ends up with some quite nice flocking patterns. Okay. So this is the results from the models, but I also mentioned at the start that, one of the outputs of this is the code itself, and it should be interpretable because we're producing symbolic logic. So it's worth having a look at what this output code kind of looks like. So for the opinion dynamics model, again, you can see the pseudocode in the top right for the reference model. This is the output code. This is a simplified version. So what I've done is gone through, combine multiple lines onto the same line in the same way that you would in a sensible way if you're writing this as real code, and rename some variables so it's kind of clear what's going on, and also done a bit of algebraic simplification on the mass, but it's still kind of logically equivalent to the raw generated code. And if we look at the pseudocode, we can see, okay, there's some function of this difference in opinion, so delta opinion. If that's less than the threshold, then we update the opinions. And over here, we can see we've got a similar condition here, something to do with this. If this temp b variable equals 0, then we do this similar code where we update opinion A and opinion B and bring them closer together. So already just at a surface evaluation, we can see, okay, this looks quite similar, but it's a bit trickier to see what's actually going on here. And it turns out this temp B value, basically, this condition is saying only update the opinions if this temp B is approximately equal to 0 with this tolerance, right? And it turns out temp B is basically a polynomial function of the difference in opinion. And you can see this polynomial plotted here. So delta opinions along the x-axis. And it turns out this expression here evaluates to true when delta opinion is exactly between minus 0.2 and 0.2, as we can see on here. So basically saying if the absolute value of this delta opinion is less than 0.2, then we will update the opinions. And it turns out the value of D that I used in the original reference model is exactly 0.2. So this has basically recreated the logic in an equivalent way, in a slightly roundabout way. And this was a really interesting experience interpreting this code. It was kind of like reviewing the code of a colleague who was a genius, but also completely insane, and did a very roundabout but elegant way of producing this functionality. So this is quite an interesting result here. And it has, as you would expect from the original model, kind of recreates exactly. It's sort of, even without looking at the code, it's pretty clear that there's going to be some it's going to be very close to the original functionality. And again, for the flocking model, we can look at the code there. This is almost easier to understand. So again, I've done a simplification process where I've renamed some variables and combined some lines. But here we can clearly see, I mean, I've named these variables, but it's because it's really clear what these concepts represent, of like separation and alignment and cohesion that we've seen in the original reference model up here. And in fact, these last two lines are basically identical, even to the point of this params value here. So here we're normalizing the target velocity and timesing it by 5. Here we're normalizing the target velocity and multiplying it by this parameter, which is 4.9987. So very, very close to 5. And this is also kind of a reminder that we're doing this parameter optimization at the same time as learning the code. Okay, so again, one thing I mentioned is that we learned from only a single trajectory of the reference model. So a relevant question is, was this just overfitting to that data set? I think this is partially answered already, because even these visualizations that we've seen, this is actually this is running with a much larger number of agents than in the training data. So I think in the training data, there's only about 600 agents. And here, I think we have maybe 1,600 or 2,000. So already we can see it generalizes to different numbers of agents and different initial starting positions, but it'd be nice to have a more quantitative way to know whether this is generalizing. So here we can see the original loss plot, and we can also see, basically we ran a lot of results evaluating the loss for different data sets produced from the reference model with different random seeds. So you can see on here, we're plotting all of these losses for different training data sets effectively, or you could think of these as like test data sets or validation data sets. So the red point is the loss from the actual training data set, which you would expect to be very low. And then we can see the losses for other data sets which are generated with different seeds are very close to this. They're quite closely clustered together. And certainly in the context of the whole training run, they're very tightly clustered around these low values. So that's definitely indicating that, we've generalized well, and that even with other data sets, it's still producing a low loss. Likewise, we can see the same for the flocking model. The true data is in red here. All of the other results are clustered very, very closely around this. So yeah, I think we're fairly happy with the generalization there. And then I guess the last point to mention, one thing to note here is, we are doing tens of millions of replacements, so mutations in the genetic algorithm. So this is only possible if we have very, very fast performance, and we can evaluate this loss function, which involves running the generated function on all of the data pairs. So it's worth just mentioning that, this was quite a focus of this project, is how performant can we make this, and quite a bit of time was sunk into kind of optimizing at the low level here. So this was implemented in Julia. I mean, it could have been done in other programming languages. I think a low-level programming language helps, but Julia definitely was a good choice here. And we need tens of millions of model runs for each experiment. We got it to around 2 milliseconds per loss function. So that's if running the generated function, the candidate function for all the data pairs in the data set takes 2 milliseconds in total. And that means we got a troll training run to kind of to complete one of those experiments down to convergence. Takes about a day on a laptop. It is kind of parallelized over a number of cores, but it's still possible to kind of run on a normal computer. So this is quite feasible. And worth talking a bit about the limitations here. So again, this is still quite restrictive DSL. It's flexible in that we've applied it to multiple domains, flocking and opinion dynamics, but there's still some constraints which reduce that search space. So there are no loops, for example. All the agents are homogeneous. So this helps us because we're only learning a single update rule for every single agent. Although you could make this, or maybe we have different types of agents that learn different rules. Again, this would expand your search problem, but may still be feasible. And these are like simple models. It's a very simple threshold model and a simple flocking model. So I think the real question is, will this scale to more complex models? I think the answer is hopefully it will. Certainly you might have to add more computational resources, but still this was quite feasible even on a laptop. So maybe you need more of a cloud server. And I guess the other thing is maybe you would have to go slightly back along that sort of spectrum of from scratch to manually coded and maybe inject a little bit more domain knowledge to kind of reduce that search space or help that search space or basically initialize it in a good place. So future work, I think we're really keen to try this on real world data rather than just data generated from models, and do this in different domains as well. I think multi-objective optimization is something we'd really like to try. So can we optimize for reduced program length as well as fit to the data? And another thing I'm interested in is kind of automatic methods for simplifying the generated code. So I went through quite a manual process of renaming variables and like kind of doing a bit of algebraic simplification. But there are actually some really cool packages in Julia which will take Julia code and manipulate it symbolically to kind of simplify algebraic expressions. So maybe we could do this automatically. There are also things like decompilation tools. And maybe a really cool idea would be actually doing this within the training loop. So, you know, maybe we can train to reduce the fitness and then do a step where we simplify the code and then keep training again. So, you know, maybe that could generate some cool results. Haven't really looked at it yet, but it's an idea. And yeah, so that's it. Just to sum up, we've successfully synthesized simple ABMs using genetic programming and matched the target data sets very well and learned the dynamics of those underlying models. We've shown that that can be learned from scratch with a fairly flexible kind of large set of DSL operators. And we produced a high performance implementation of this in Julia. And that's it. Yeah, thanks very much for listening. I don't know if we have time for questions, but yeah, willing to answer anything.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rory. Great talk. Really inspiring work. There are a couple of questions and comments in the chat. I'll go through. I think it was really interesting how you had combined the parameter optimization, especially with the rule evolution as well. Mark talks about parsimony pressure, and I think you pointed out how you can use if we could integrate the compiling step to sort of scrunch down the rules in the middle of the evolutionary process. I think that could help with bloat. But Mark points out how you could apply a parsimony pressure in the evolutionary process to reduce bloat as well. We have a question from Noor to if you could show the actual rules that were generated. I think you actually probably had a slide on that. I don't know if you want to.
Yep. So I think I've got it for both models. We've got flocking and opinion dynamics. Is there any particular one you're interested in? Also, I don't know what's going on here. Okay.
Yeah, I asked that before you got to that slide, so I was just a bit impatient and very excited to see it. Thank you. Very, very interesting work.
Yeah, and obviously the slides are up, so if you want to take a more detailed look, I could also share the raw generated code. So obviously this is simplified, but yeah.
Great. Excellent. Lux also had asked what the generated models.
Oh, same deal. I was impatient too.
Same thing.
Okay. And are they human readable? Yeah, I guess they were. And Josh is asking whether the evolved rules look like the Diffun original. Is pretty much
variation on the same question. I have another thought though, if I may.
Yes, Josh.
So first of all, I think this is just utterly fabulous work, and I mean, to be able to self-organize these patterns and learn rules from a literal primordial soup of operators and functions, I think it's just really, really great. On the loss function, I thought there's also, you also impinge on another important topic that I wonder if you thought about, which is if you look at the loss functions, they're stepwise, right? There are these big stepwise things, which means that the change in loss, delta loss, the absolute value of the delta loss is spiky and looks a lot like punctuated equilibrium. And I'm wondering if you explore, if that's artifactual, or if all these experiments look like punctuated equilibrium, in which you have another point you might want to make, which I think would be another contribution. But in any event, I just think it's fabulous stuff and goes everywhere, and I'm just so excited to see.
Oh, great! Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. So you mean the way that the loss function is decreasing, and then sort of finds some kind of innovation, like decreases a lot in a big jump? Is that
right?
Kind of
that's what I'm saying, right? And if you take the absolute value of that function, it looks a very spiky thing, just like the kind of punctuated equilibrium debate from, you know, Etheridge and Gould and all of this stuff. So I mean, that's very interesting if you decided to explore how general that phenomenon is in the loss.
Yeah, that's a really good
trajectory.
Point. Yeah, one thing we wanted to do and sort of ran out of time was a bit more analysis on kind of what actually happens before and after in those big jumps.
Oh,
so we recorded the data, we just haven't got into it, but I think this is a really more general point of like why it happens in that pattern. It'd be very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Tuong has a question. So after that, we should probably get on to the next talk. There's also a request to make the code available if possible. So maybe if you could drop the repository in the chat, that would help.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not open source yet, but I think that would be a really sensible thing to do. So we're hoping to open source soon. So as soon as it is, the code is a bit messy and it's possibly not in a kind of usable state by anyone else right now, but we really do intend to make it open source.
Very understandable. Tuong, you want to go real quick and then let's get to the next one.
I have a question about the fitness. So like you say, the loss function is by you comparing the at the agent level, right? So it's a micro level comparing agent to the simulated agent to the one that you synthesize. Is it correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we're doing this on for every agent and every time step. Those are the data pairs. I think another really interesting next step would be, it probably is more useful to do things at more of the macro level. So try and recreate macro level patterns. I think in flocking, it's quite hard because you basically almost have to write a flocking model to define.
Yes, that's what I'm interested in as well. It's like, if you look at macro level, I'm more interested in, let's say the model generates two group of agent moving around. I'm more interested in the two group rather than how the agent moving around to form that group. I don't care about it. I just care that they form two groups. So I'm interested in if you have a way to create a fitness function at the macro level.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's very flexible in the sense that we could put any loss function in there. It's just, this is the one we chose. But I think certainly next step would be looking at more macro aggregate kind of loss functions. So, yeah.
That's it for me.
Excellent. Maybe if you could reply to the other questions in the chat as they pop up. Excellent talk. All right. Moving on.